behind the polished gates of Windsor Castle, where centuries of tradition meet modern monarchy, a storm was brewing that would shake the very foundations of the House of Windsor. What started as a simple family gathering would expose deep-rooted tensions, generational conflicts, and protective instincts that had been simmering beneath the surface for years. The world sees the picture-perfect royal family, elegant appearances, charitable works, and united front. But on this particular autumn evening, when the golden leaves danced in the crisp British air, Catherine, the Princess of Wales, would find herself standing at a crossroads that would test not only her role as a mother, but her position within the most scrutinized family on earth. Sometimes the most explosive moments come from the quietest confrontations. Sometimes protecting what matters most means risking everything you've worked to build. And sometimes even princesses must choose between keeping the peace and keeping their children safe. This is the story of that choice and the royal reckoning that followed. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the manicured gardens of Highgrove House as Catherine stepped out of the sleek black Range Rover, her children following close behind. Princess Charlotte, now 10 years old, clutched her mother's hand tightly, her usual bright smile notably absent from her delicate features. Prince George walked beside them with the measured steps of a future king, while little Prince Louis bounded ahead with the carefree energy that only a 6-year-old could possess. Catherine had been dreading this family gathering for weeks. What should have been a simple afternoon tea with King Charles and Queen Camilla had been weighing heavily on her mind ever since the phone call 3 days earlier. Charlotte had come home from her riding lesson in tears, refusing to speak about what had happened. It wasn't until bedtime, when the little princess finally broke down in her mother's arms, that the truth came spilling out. Grandmama Camilla said I was being silly, Charlotte had whispered through her tears, using the formal title she'd been taught to address her step-grandmother. She said I was acting like a baby and that royal children don't cry over little things. But it wasn't little to me, Mama. My pony got scared and I fell off, and it really hurt. Catherine's heart had clenched as her daughter continued, her small voice breaking with each word. She said Papa would be disappointed in me if he knew I cried in front of everyone at the stables. She said real princesses are brave and strong, and crying shows weakness. I tried to stop Mama. I really did, but I couldn't. The memory of that conversation played in Catherine's mind as they approached the grand entrance of Highgrove. She had spent years carefully navigating the complex dynamics of the royal family, always mindful of her position as an outsider who had married into centuries of tradition. She had learned to bite her tongue, to smile when she disagreed, and to find diplomatic solutions to family conflicts. But this was different. This involved her child. William had been traveling for royal duties when Charlotte came home upset, and Catherine had wrestled with whether to tell him immediately or handle the situation herself. She knew her husband's complicated relationship with his stepmother, knew the delicate balance he tried to maintain between loyalty to his father and protection of his own family. But she also knew that if William heard about this incident, his reaction might cause irreparable damage to family relationships that had taken years to carefully construct. As they entered the familiar hallway lined with family portraits and fresh flowers from the estate gardens, Catherine made a decision that would change everything. She would address this matter directly with Camilla, woman to woman, mother to stepmother. She owed it to Charlotte to ensure this kind of incident never happened again. Mama, do I have to talk to Grandmama Camilla today? Charlotte whispered as they made their way toward the drawing room, where afternoon tea was traditionally served. Catherine knelt down to her daughter's eye level, smoothing a strand of the little girl's honey-colored hair. You don't have to do anything that makes you uncomfortable, darling. But remember what we talked about. You did nothing wrong by having feelings, and you did nothing wrong by expressing them. Being royal doesn't mean being perfect or never showing emotion. The sound of footsteps echoed down the corridor, and King Charles appeared, his face lighting up at the sight of his grandchildren. At 75, The newly crowned monarch still carried himself with the bearing of a man who had spent his entire life preparing for his role, though the weight of recent responsibilities had added new lines around his eyes. "My dear ones," Charles exclaimed, opening his arms wide. George stepped forward first, offering a formal handshake that his grandfather accepted with a warm smile before pulling the boy into an embrace. Louis launched himself at his grandfather with his usual enthusiasm, chattering excitedly about a butterfly he had seen in their garden at Adelaide Cottage. But it was Charlotte who captured Charles's attention with her unusually subdued demeanor. The king had always shared a special bond with his only granddaughter, often saying she reminded him of his own mother in her childhood photos. He noticed immediately that something was amiss. "Princess Charlotte," he said gently, crouching down to her level with some difficulty due to his advancing years. "You seem rather quiet today. Are you quite well?" Charlotte glanced nervously at her mother before nodding politely. "Yes, Grandpapa. Thank you for asking." Charles's eyebrows rose slightly at the formal response. Charlotte was usually much more animated during their visits, full of questions about the estate's gardens and eager to share stories from school. This polite but distant behavior was entirely unlike her. "Well then," Charles said, straightening up and addressing Catherine. "Camilla is in the blue drawing room, going over some correspondence from her literacy charity. She's been looking forward to your visit." Catherine felt a tightness in her chest at the mention of her stepmother-in-law. "Wonderful. I was hoping we might have a chance to chat." As they made their way through the house, Catherine couldn't help but notice how Charlotte seemed to shrink closer to her side with each step. The little girl who usually ran ahead to explore the various rooms and treasures of Highgrove was now practically hiding behind her mother's skirt. The blue drawing room was awash in afternoon light, streaming through tall windows that overlooked the organic garden Charles had spent decades cultivating. Queen Camilla sat in her favorite armchair, a stack of papers balanced on her lap, and reading glasses perched on the end of her nose. At 76, she had finally grown into her role as queen consort, though the journey had been longer and more challenging than anyone could have anticipated. "Catherine, darling," Camilla exclaimed, setting aside her papers and rising to greet them. She kissed Catherine on both cheeks in the continental style she preferred, then turned her attention to the children. "And my lovely grandchildren, how wonderful to see you all." George and Louis stepped forward dutifully to receive their grandmother's kisses, but Charlotte remained pressed against her mother's side. Camilla noticed the little girl's reluctance immediately, and Catherine saw something flicker across the older woman's face, perhaps annoyance, or maybe concern. "Charlotte, dear, come and give Grandmama a proper greeting," Camilla said, her tone carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. Catherine felt her daughter's small hand tighten in hers. "Charlotte is feeling a bit shy today," she said diplomatically. "Perhaps after we've had some tea and biscuits." Camilla's eyes narrowed almost imperceptibly. "Nonsense. Royal children must learn proper manners, regardless of their moods. Charlotte, I insist you come here." The tension in the room was palpable. George and Louis exchanged uncertain glances, clearly sensing that something was wrong, but not understanding what. Charles, who had followed them into the room, seemed oblivious to the undercurrent of conflict as he poured himself a gin and tonic from the drinks trolley. Catherine felt a surge of protective anger rise in her chest. This was exactly the kind of rigid, unfeeling approach that had traumatized her daughter at the stables. But she also knew that challenging Camilla directly in front of the children and Charles could create an even more difficult situation. "Charlotte," Catherine said gently, "why don't you go with your brothers to see if Cook has any of those special biscuits you like? I need to speak with Grandpapa and Grandmama Camilla about grown-up things." Relief flooded Charlotte's face as she nodded eagerly. The three children left the room, though Catherine noticed that Charlotte kept glancing back over her shoulder as they departed. Once the children were gone, the atmosphere in the room shifted dramatically. Charles settled into his chair with his drink, apparently unaware of the storm that was about to break. Camilla resumed her seat and picked up her papers, clearly expecting the conversation to return to pleasantries and small talk. But Catherine remained standing, her posture straight and her expression serious. This was the moment she had been preparing for during the entire drive from Windsor. This was when she would finally address what had happened to her daughter. Consequences be damned. "Camilla," Catherine began, her voice steady but carrying an edge that made both Charles and his wife look up sharply. "I think we need to discuss what happened at Charlotte's writing lesson earlier this week." The papers in Camilla's hands rustled as her grip tightened. "I'm afraid I don't know what you're referring to," she replied coolly, though the slight flush in her cheeks suggested otherwise. Catherine took a deep breath. She had crossed the Rubicon now, and there was no going back. "I think you do know exactly what I'm referring to, and I think it's time we had an honest conversation about how my children are being treated when I'm not around to protect them." The silence that followed was deafening. Charles looked between the two women with growing confusion and alarm, while Camilla's face hardened into the mask of regal composure she had perfected over decades in the public eye. But Catherine was no longer the uncertain young woman who had entered this family 15 years earlier. She was a mother, a future queen, and she had found her voice. The real confrontation was about to begin, and nothing would ever be quite the same again. The grandfather clock in the corner of the blue drawing room ticked loudly in the oppressive silence that followed Catherine's words. King Charles set down his gin and tonic with deliberate care, the crystal glass making a soft clink against the mahogany side table. His weathered face showed the kind of confusion that comes from suddenly finding oneself in the middle of a battlefield without understanding how the war began. "Catherine," Charles said carefully, his voice carrying the diplomatic tone he had perfected through decades of navigating political minefields, "perhaps you could enlighten us about what exactly transpired at Charlotte's writing lesson. I must confess, I'm rather in the dark about this entire matter." Camilla's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, but she maintained her composed facade. "Yes, Catherine, do tell us about this supposed incident. I'm quite curious to hear your version of events." The dismissive emphasis on the word version sent a surge of indignation through Catherine's chest. She had spent years swallowing similar subtle slights, always choosing diplomacy over confrontation for the sake of family harmony. But watching her daughter's spirit dim under the weight of Camilla's harsh words had changed something fundamental in Catherine's approach to these delicate family dynamics. "My version," Catherine repeated, her voice remaining level despite the fire in her green eyes. "Charlotte came home in tears, Camilla. She told me that when she fell from her pony and became upset, you informed her that royal children don't cry over little things. You told a 10-year-old girl that expressing natural emotions after being frightened and hurt was a sign of weakness." Charles shifted uncomfortably in his chair, his loyalty torn between his wife and his daughter-in-law. He had witnessed enough family conflicts over the decades to recognize the signs of a confrontation that could have lasting consequences. "Surely there's been some misunderstanding," he said hopefully. "Children sometimes misinterpret adult guidance, and emotions can run high after an accident." Catherine turned to face her father-in-law directly, her respect for him evident despite her anger. "With all due respect, Charles, Charlotte didn't misinterpret anything. She repeated Camilla's exact words to me, including the part where she was told that William would be disappointed in her if he knew she had cried in front of others." The mention of his son's name caused Charles's expression to shift from diplomatic concern to genuine alarm. William's protective instincts regarding his children were legendary within the family, and Charles knew that any perceived threat to their emotional well-being would provoke a response that could shatter the carefully maintained peace they had all worked so hard to achieve. Camilla finally set aside her papers entirely, her movements sharp and deliberate. "I was trying to help Charlotte develop the resilience she'll need as a member of this family," she said, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had learned harsh lessons about royal life through decades of public scrutiny and personal attacks. "The world will not be kind to her simply because she's a princess. In fact, it will be far more critical of her than it would be of any ordinary child. I was teaching her to be strong. You were teaching her to suppress her emotions, Catherine countered, stepping closer to where Camilla sat. You were teaching her that her natural responses to fear and pain are shameful. That's not strength, Camilla. That's emotional damage. The accusation hung in the air like smoke from a fired cannon. Charles rose from his chair, clearly recognizing that the conversation had moved beyond diplomacy into territory that could have permanent consequences for family relationships. "Ladies, please," he began, but Camilla cut him off with a sharp gesture. "Emotional damage?" Camilla's voice rose slightly, the first crack in her composed facade. "I survived 30 years of being called every vile name imaginable by the press and the public. I endured death threats, character assassination, and the constant knowledge that half the country wished I would simply disappear. I learned to be strong because I had to, and I'm trying to pass that strength on to Charlotte before she faces her own trials." Catherine felt a moment of sympathy for the older woman's obvious pain, but her maternal instincts overrode any diplomatic considerations. "Your experiences, as difficult as they were, don't give you the right to inflict that same emotional suppression on my daughter. Charlotte isn't you, Camilla. She's a child who deserves to feel safe expressing her emotions, especially to family members who should be offering comfort and support." "Safe." Camilla stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the Persian rug. "There is no safety in this life, Catherine. There is no privacy, no forgiveness for human moments, and certainly no allowance for weakness. The sooner Charlotte learns that, the better prepared she'll be for what's coming." The raw honesty in Camilla's words revealed layers of pain and trauma that she had clearly never fully processed. Catherine realized that this confrontation was about far more than one incident at a riding stable. It was about two fundamentally different philosophies of survival in the royal fishbowl, shaped by vastly different experiences of entering the family. "What's coming doesn't have to be what you experienced," Catherine said, her voice softening slightly, but remaining firm. "Times have changed. The public's relationship with the royal family has evolved. We have more control over our narrative now, more ability to show authentic humanity without it being seen as weakness." Camilla laughed bitterly, the sound harsh in the elegant room. "You think you have control? You think your careful image management and strategic appearances have actually changed anything fundamental? Catherine, dear, you've been protected by William's popularity and by following a very safe, very conventional path. But Charlotte will face challenges you can't even imagine." Charles attempted to interject again, clearly distressed by the escalating nature of the conflict. "Camilla, Catherine, surely we can find common ground here. We all want what's best for the children." But Catherine was no longer in a mood for diplomatic solutions. The protective fire that had been building since Charlotte's tearful confession had reached its full intensity, and she was prepared to say things that might have permanent consequences. "What's best for Charlotte," Catherine said, her voice carrying a steel that surprised even her, "is having family members who support her emotional well-being rather than trying to break her spirit in the name of preparation. What's best for Charlotte is knowing that when she's hurt or scared, the adults in her life will offer comfort, not criticism." "Comfort won't prepare her for what this life demands," Camilla shot back. "I've watched royal children who were coddled and protected struggle terribly when they finally faced real scrutiny. I've seen what happens when they're not prepared for the harsh realities of public life." Catherine's eyes flashed with understanding and anger. "You're talking about William. You're talking about Harry. You think their struggles were because they weren't hardened enough as children, rather than because they were traumatized by their mother's death and then failed by the very system you're advocating for." The mention of Diana's sons and their well-documented struggles with mental health created a charged silence in the room. Charles's face went pale, and Camilla's composure finally cracked completely. "Don't you dare," Camilla whispered, her voice shaking with emotion. "Don't you dare use their pain as a weapon in this argument." But Catherine pressed on, driven by a maternal fury that wouldn't be contained. I'm not using their pain as a weapon. I'm using it as evidence. William and Harry's struggles weren't caused by being too soft as children. They were caused by being forced to perform strength they didn't feel, to suppress grief that needed to be processed, and to maintain public composure while their private world was falling apart. That's exactly what you're trying to do to Charlotte. The accusation hit its target with devastating accuracy. Camilla sank back in her chair as if physically struck, her face cycling through emotions too complex and painful to easily categorize. Charles moved toward his wife instinctively, but she waved him away with a trembling hand. "You don't understand," Camilla said, her voice barely above a whisper. "You can't understand what it's like to watch people you love being destroyed by this life, while feeling powerless to protect them. I thought if I could teach Charlotte to be stronger than I was, stronger than Diana was, she might survive it better." The raw vulnerability in Camilla's admission created a moment of profound silence. Catherine realized that her adversary wasn't motivated by cruelty or power, but by her own deep trauma and a misguided attempt to protect Charlotte from experiences similar to her own. But understanding Camilla's motivation didn't change Catherine's fundamental position about her daughter's emotional well-being. "I appreciate that your intentions come from a place of caring," Catherine said, her voice gentler, but still firm. "But your methods are wrong. Strength doesn't come from suppressing emotions. It comes from learning to process them healthily, from having a support system that validates your experiences, and from knowing that your feelings matter to the people who love you." The confrontation had reached a crossroads. Both women stood surrounded by the debris of carefully maintained family harmony, forced to choose between backing down or escalating to a point from which there might be no return. The decision they made in this moment would echo through Charlotte's childhood and potentially through generations of the royal family's approach to emotional health and child-rearing. Charles cleared his throat softly, recognizing that his next words could either defuse the situation or make it exponentially worse. But before he could speak, the sound of children's laughter drifted in from the hallway, a reminder of the innocent lives that hung in the balance of this adult conflict. The sound of children's laughter from the hallway served as a sobering reminder of what was truly at stake in this confrontation. Catherine felt her resolve strengthen as she imagined Charlotte, George, and Louis playing innocently, while the adults who should be protecting them engaged in a battle that would determine their emotional future within the royal family. Charles seized the moment of pause to attempt one final diplomatic intervention. "Perhaps," he said carefully, "we might consider this an opportunity to establish clearer guidelines about how we all interact with the children going forward. Surely we can find an approach that honors both Catherine's concerns about emotional support and Camilla's desire to prepare them for their future roles." But Catherine had moved beyond the possibility of compromise. The weeks of watching Charlotte's confidence slowly rebuild after the riding incident had shown her exactly how much damage had been done by one afternoon of harsh criticism. She couldn't risk allowing such treatment to continue under the guise of family harmony. "Charles," Catherine said, turning to face her father-in-law with the full authority of her position as a future queen, "I need you to understand something. This isn't a difference of opinion about child-rearing techniques that can be solved with guidelines or committees. This is about fundamental respect for my children's emotional well-being." She paused, letting the weight of her words settle in the room before continuing. When Charlotte was upset after her fall, she needed comfort and reassurance. Instead, she received criticism and shame. That's not preparation for royal life. That's emotional abuse. The word abuse hit the room like a thunderclap. Camilla gasped audibly, her hand flying to her chest, while Charles's face went through a series of expressions ranging from shock to concern to something approaching anger. "Catherine," Charles said, his voice carrying a warning tone, "that's a very serious accusation to make." "It's a very serious situation," Catherine replied without backing down, "and it requires a serious response. I will not allow my children to be subjected to treatment that undermines their sense of self-worth, regardless of who that treatment comes from. Camilla found her voice again, though it shook with a mixture of hurt and indignation. Abuse? You're accusing me of child abuse because I try to teach Charlotte to be resilient? Because I refused to coddle her when she had a minor accident? Catherine's training in psychology, gained during her years of charity work with mental health organizations, informed her response. Emotional abuse doesn't require physical violence, Camilla. It can be as simple as consistently invalidating a child's emotions, teaching them that their natural responses are wrong or shameful, or creating an environment where they feel unsafe expressing their true feelings. The clinical accuracy of Catherine's definition clearly unnerved Camilla, who had likely never considered her actions through such a lens. But rather than retreat, she doubled down on her position. Every generation of this family has learned to control their emotions in public, Camilla said, her voice rising with desperation. Your own husband learned it. His father learned it. It's not abuse. It's survival in a world that's watching your every move. Catherine shook her head, her patience finally exhausted. William learned to suppress his emotions, yes. And look at the cost. He spent years in therapy trying to undo the damage of being told his feelings didn't matter after his mother died. He's worked incredibly hard to learn how to process grief and trauma in healthy ways, and I will not allow you to inflict that same damage on our children. The mention of William's therapeutic journey, something the family rarely discussed openly, created another moment of stunned silence. Charles shifted uncomfortably, clearly aware of his son's struggles, but unprepared to have them aired as part of this confrontation. William's therapy, Charles said slowly, was to help him process extraordinary circumstances. The loss of his mother in such a public way would have been traumatic regardless of how he was raised. Catherine turned to face Charles fully, recognizing that she needed to make him understand the larger pattern at play. The trauma wasn't just from losing Diana, Charles. It was from being forced to walk behind her coffin while the world watched. It was from being told he needed to be strong for the nation while he was still a child, processing the most devastating loss of his life. It was from learning that his private pain was less important than public perception. She gestured toward the door, where they could still hear the faint sounds of the children playing. Charlotte is 10 years old. She fell off her pony and got scared. Her natural, healthy response was to cry and seek comfort. Instead of receiving that comfort, she was told her emotions were inappropriate and that her father would be disappointed in her. How is that different from what William experienced? The parallel Catherine drew was devastating in its clarity. Charles had spent years grappling with his own regrets about how his son's grief had been managed after Diana's death, and the suggestion that similar patterns were being repeated with his granddaughter clearly struck him deeply. Camilla, meanwhile, was fighting desperately to maintain her position. It's completely different, she insisted. William and Harry were dealing with genuine tragedy. Charlotte had a minor riding accident. Learning to put such incidents in proper perspective is part of growing up royal. At 10 years old, Catherine's voice carried an incredulity that cut through Camilla's arguments. She's 10, Camilla. She's supposed to have emotional responses to being scared and hurt. She's supposed to seek comfort from adults she trusts. The fact that she's royal doesn't change her basic psychological needs as a child. The confrontation had reached a point where fundamental worldviews were colliding irreconcilably. Camilla's approach, forged in the crucible of public humiliation and media attacks, emphasized emotional armor and public composure above all else. Catherine's approach, informed by modern understanding of child psychology and her own experiences as a mother, prioritized emotional health and authentic self-expression. I won't apologize for trying to prepare her for reality, Camilla said, her voice hardening with determination. I won't apologize for teaching her that this life requires sacrifice and strength. And I certainly won't apologize to someone who has never faced the kind of scrutiny and attacks that I have endured. The personal attack implicit in Camilla's words, The suggestion that Catherine's relatively smooth entry into the royal family disqualified her from understanding its challenges struck at one of Catherine's most sensitive points. She had worked for years to prove herself worthy of her position, always aware that she was viewed by some as an outsider who had married into privilege without paying the same price as others. But instead of becoming defensive, Catherine used Camilla's attack as fuel for her argument. "You're absolutely right," she said, surprising both Charles and Camilla with her concession. "I haven't faced the same level of public hostility that you endured. Do you know why?" She waited for a response that didn't come before continuing. "Because the world has changed. Because William and I have been able to control our narrative in ways that weren't available to previous generations. Because we've been able to show authentic emotion and vulnerability without it being seen as weakness by the public." Catherine moved closer to Camilla, her voice becoming more intense with each word. "That's the future Charlotte can have if we don't damage her first. She can be strong and resilient while still being emotionally healthy. She can handle criticism and scrutiny while still knowing that her feelings are valid and important. But only if the people who claim to love her stop teaching her that emotions are the enemy." The room fell silent except for the steady ticking of the grandfather clock. Outside, the afternoon light was beginning to fade, casting long shadows across the organic gardens that Charles had so lovingly cultivated. The beauty and peace of the setting stood in stark contrast to the emotional warfare being waged in the elegant drawing room. Charles finally broke the silence, his voice heavy with the weight of difficult decisions. "Catherine," he said carefully, "what exactly are you asking of us? What outcome are you hoping to achieve from this conversation?" The question forced Catherine to articulate what had been building in her mind throughout the confrontation. She realized that she wasn't just seeking an apology or a promise to do better. She was demanding a fundamental shift in how the royal family approached the emotional well-being of its youngest members. "I'm asking you to choose," Catherine said, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what she was about to propose. "You can continue to prioritize public perception and traditional approaches over the psychological health of your grandchildren. Or you can support me in creating an environment where they can develop genuine resilience based on emotional security rather than emotional suppression." She paused, looking directly at both Charles and Camilla. "But you can't do both. And if you choose the old way, then William and I will have to make some very difficult decisions about our children's relationship with certain family members." The ultimatum hung in the air like a sword suspended by a thread. Catherine had just threatened to potentially limit Charles's access to his grandchildren unless he was willing to confront the toxic patterns that had damaged previous generations of royals. It was perhaps the most audacious power play anyone had ever made in this particular corner of the Windsor family dynamic. Charles's face went through a series of complex expressions as he processed the implications of Catherine's words. Camilla, meanwhile, looked as though she had been struck by lightning, clearly unprepared for such a direct challenge to her authority and approach. The confrontation had reached its crisis point. The next word spoken would determine not just Charlotte's future interactions with her step-grandmother, but potentially the entire structure of relationships within this branch of the royal family. The ultimatum Catherine had delivered settled over the blue drawing room like a heavy shroud, transforming the elegant space into an arena where the future of family relationships hung in the balance. King Charles stood frozen between his wife and daughter-in-law, the weight of his crown suddenly, feeling heavier than ever as he grappled with a choice that would define his reign not just as a monarch, but as a grandfather. Camilla's face had gone pale, the carefully applied makeup doing little to hide the shock and hurt that radiated from her features. For someone who had spent decades fighting for acceptance within the royal family, the suggestion that her access to her step-grandchildren might be limited felt like the ultimate rejection of everything she had worked to build. "You would use the children as weapons against us," Camilla said, her voice barely above a whisper, but carrying the sharp edge of betrayal. "You would deny Charles his grandchildren because you disagree with my methods of guidance. Catherine felt the accusation like a physical blow, but she refused to retreat from her position. I'm not using anyone as weapons, Camilla. I'm protecting my children from emotional harm. There's a significant difference, though I understand it might be difficult for you to see it that way. Charles cleared his throat, his diplomatic instincts warring with his personal desires. As king, he understood the delicate balance required to maintain family unity. As a grandfather who had already missed too much of his own son's childhoods due to duty and circumstance, the thought of losing precious time with George, Charlotte, and Louis was almost unbearable. "Catherine," Charles began, his voice carrying the measured tone of someone choosing words with extreme care, "surely you must understand that such restrictions would have implications far beyond our personal relationships. The children's absence from family gatherings would be noticed. Questions would be asked. The press would inevitably create narratives that could damage the monarchy itself. The mention of public perception and media coverage struck at the heart of the fundamental conflict. Catherine realized that Charles was still thinking in terms of managing appearances rather than addressing the underlying issues that had created this crisis. "With all due respect, Charles," Catherine replied, her voice carrying a new hardness, "the press already creates narratives about our family relationships. They speculate about tensions and conflicts constantly. But what they don't see is the impact of those conflicts on 3 innocent children who deserve better from the adults who claim to love them." She moved to the window, gazing out at the gardens where she could see George teaching Louis how to skip stones in the ornamental pond, while Charlotte sat nearby, still subdued, but managing a small smile at her brother's antics. The sight strengthened her resolve. "Look at them," Catherine said, gesturing toward the window. "Charlotte has been walking on eggshells since that riding lesson, second-guessing every emotion she feels, wondering if expressing normal childhood feelings will disappoint the adults in her life. That's not strength or resilience, Charles. That's anxiety and self-doubt being programmed into a 10-year-old child." Camilla rose from her chair with difficulty, her age and the emotional strain of the confrontation evident in her movements. She joined Catherine at the window, watching the children play in the golden afternoon light. "I see them," Camilla said quietly. "I see beautiful, privileged children who have no idea what awaits them as they grow older. I see innocence that will be shattered the first time they face real criticism or genuine hardship. And I see you try to preserve that innocence in ways that will ultimately make them more vulnerable, not less." The 2 women stood side by side, separated by only a few feet physically, but by decades of different experiences and fundamentally opposing philosophies about survival in the royal fishbowl. "What do you think will happen?" Camilla continued, her voice gaining strength, "when Charlotte faces her first real scandal or controversy? When the press turns on her the way they've turned on every royal woman before her? When she discovers that public opinion can shift overnight, and that people who claim to love her can become her harshest critics?" Catherine turned to face Camilla directly, recognizing the genuine pain and concern behind the older woman's harsh methods. "I think she'll handle it better if she's learned that her emotions are valid and that the people who truly love her will support her through difficult times. I think she'll be more resilient if she's developed a healthy sense of self-worth that isn't dependent on public approval or the suppression of her authentic feelings." The philosophical difference between them was stark and seemingly unbridgeable. Camilla believed that strength came from hardening oneself against emotion and criticism. Catherine believed that true strength came from emotional intelligence and secure attachments to people who provided unconditional support. Charles had been listening to this exchange with growing understanding of the complexity of the situation. He began to see that this wasn't simply a disagreement about one incident, but a fundamental clash between old and new approaches to royal life and child-rearing. "Catherine," Charles said slowly, "I'm beginning to understand your perspective. And I must admit that watching my own sons struggle with the aftermath of their childhood experiences has given me considerable pause about traditional methods. Hope flickered in Catherine's eyes as she sensed a potential shift in Charles's position. But Camilla turned sharply, clearly alarmed by her husband's apparent wavering. "Charles," Camilla said urgently, "you can't seriously be considering undermining everything this family has stood for, everything that has kept it strong through centuries of challenges, because of one 10-year-old's tears after a minor accident." The dismissive reference to Charlotte's pain as one 10-year-old's tears was exactly the wrong thing to say in that moment. Catherine felt her remaining patience evaporate completely. "There it is again," Catherine said, her voice cutting through the room with surgical precision. The dismissal, the minimization, the suggestion that a child's genuine emotional response to fear and pain is somehow trivial or unimportant. That attitude is exactly the problem, Camilla. She moved away from the window to face both Charles and Camilla directly. This isn't about one incident anymore. This is about a pattern of behavior that teaches children their feelings don't matter, that emotional expression is weakness, and that performing strength is more important than developing genuine resilience. Catherine's voice grew stronger with each word, fueled by months of watching her daughter's confidence slowly rebuild and her determination to prevent similar damage in the future. "I won't allow my children to learn those lessons. I won't allow them to grow up believing that love is conditional on their ability to suppress their authentic selves." The room fell silent again, but this time the silence carried a different weight. Charles was clearly wrestling with memories of his own childhood and the impact of similar approaches on William and Harry. Camilla was beginning to understand that her position was becoming increasingly isolated. "What if," Charles said hesitantly, "we were to establish some new approaches to family interactions? What if we could find ways to honor both the need for strength and the importance of emotional health?" Catherine studied her father-in-law's face, trying to determine if he was genuinely committed to change or simply seeking another diplomatic solution that would avoid addressing the core issues. "What would that look like in practice, Charles?" Catherine asked. "Because I need concrete assurances, not just good intentions. Charlotte needs to know that expressing her emotions won't result in criticism or shame from family members." Camilla spoke up, her voice carrying a note of desperation. "And what about preparing her for the realities she'll face? What about teaching her the skills she'll need to survive in public life?" Catherine turned to address Camilla directly, recognizing that any sustainable solution would need to account for the older woman's concerns as well as her own. "I'm not opposed to teaching the children about public life and its demands," Catherine said carefully. "But there's a difference between preparation and damage. There's a difference between teaching appropriate public behavior and teaching that private emotions are shameful." She paused, choosing her next words with care. "Charlotte can learn to compose herself in public situations while still knowing that her private emotions are valid and important. She can develop the skills needed for royal life while maintaining her emotional authenticity in safe, supportive relationships with family." The suggestion offered a potential path forward that might address both women's concerns, but implementing such an approach would require Camilla to fundamentally alter her methods and Charles to actively support a new philosophy of child-rearing within the family. As the three adults grappled with these possibilities, the sound of children's voices grew closer, suggesting that George, Charlotte, and Louis were returning from their exploration of the gardens. Whatever decision was reached in the next few minutes would affect not just their immediate well-being, but their entire understanding of their place within the royal family and their relationship with the adults who shaped their world. The sound of approaching children's voices created an urgency that cut through the philosophical debates and emotional confrontations of the afternoon. Catherine, Charles, and Camilla all recognized that whatever resolution they reached needed to be established before George, Charlotte, and Louis returned to the drawing room, bringing with them the innocent energy that had been notably absent from their complex adult negotiations. Charles stepped forward, his role as both king and grandfather compelling him toward a decision that felt monumental in its implications. The afternoon light, streaming through the tall windows, caught the worry lines around his eyes, evidence of the weight he carried not just as a monarch, but as a man trying to balance competing loyalties and responsibilities. "Catherine," Charles said, his voice carrying the gravity of someone making a proclamation that would echo through family relationships for years to come. "I want you to know that I've heard everything you've said today. More importantly, I've understood it." He glanced at Camilla, whose face reflected a mixture of hope and apprehension. "My wife's intentions have always been to strengthen our grandchildren for the challenges they'll face. But I'm beginning to see that perhaps our methods need to evolve with our understanding of how children actually develop resilience." Camilla's composure finally cracked completely, tears beginning to form in her eyes as she realized that her husband was choosing to support Catherine's position over her own deeply held convictions about royal child-rearing. "Charles," Camilla said, her voice breaking, "I've only ever wanted to protect them. I've only ever wanted to spare them the pain that I've watched others in this family endure. If my methods have been harsh, it's because life has been harsh to me, and I thought that preparation would be a kindness." The raw vulnerability in Camilla's admission created a moment of profound emotional complexity. Catherine felt her anger begin to soften as she recognized the genuine love and concern that had motivated Camilla's approach, even as she remained firm in her conviction that the methods were wrong. "I believe that you love them," Catherine said gently, her voice carrying none of the edge that had characterized earlier parts of their confrontation. "But love isn't always enough if it's expressed in ways that cause harm. The children need to know that they're loved for who they are, not for how well they can suppress their authentic selves." Charles moved toward his wife, placing a supportive hand on her shoulder while maintaining his gaze on Catherine. "What specific changes would you need to see," he asked, "to feel confident that the children's emotional well-being is being prioritized?" The question forced Catherine to move beyond criticism toward concrete solutions. She realized that this moment represented not just an opportunity to protect her own children, but potentially to create lasting change in how the royal family approached the psychological health of its youngest members. "First," Catherine said, organizing her thoughts quickly, "I need assurance that when the children are upset or emotional, their feelings will be acknowledged and validated rather than dismissed or criticized. A 10-year-old who cries after falling from a pony should receive comfort, not lectures about royal behavior." She paused, looking directly at Camilla. "Second, I need to know that preparation for public life will be age-appropriate and balanced with recognition of their developmental needs. Charlotte doesn't need to learn adult-level emotional suppression. She needs to learn how to express herself appropriately in different settings, while knowing that her private emotions are always acceptable." Camilla wiped her eyes with a handkerchief, struggling to process the implications of what Catherine was requesting. "And if I disagree with what I see as coddling? If I believe a firmer approach is needed in a particular situation?" Catherine considered the question carefully, recognizing that complete agreement wasn't realistic, but that basic respect for her parental authority was non-negotiable. "If you have concerns about how I'm handling a situation with my children," Catherine said, "then you discuss it with me privately, not with the children themselves. You don't undermine their emotional security to make a point about resilience. And you certainly don't tell them that their father would be disappointed in their natural reactions to fear or pain." The specific reference to the original incident reminded everyone of what had triggered this confrontation. Charles nodded slowly, understanding that Catherine was establishing boundaries that went beyond general parenting philosophy to specific behavioral expectations. "That seems reasonable," Charles said, looking to Camilla for her response. Camilla was quiet for a long moment, clearly wrestling with the prospect of fundamentally altering approaches she had held for decades. Finally, she spoke in a voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know if I can change completely," Camilla admitted. "I don't know if I can unlearn 40 years of believing that strength comes from emotional control. But I could try to remember that they're children first and royals second." The honesty in Camilla's response touched Catherine in ways she hadn't expected. She realized that asking someone to completely abandon coping mechanisms that had helped them survive decades of public scrutiny might be unrealistic, but requesting respect for her children's emotional needs was not. "I'm not asking you to change everything about yourself," Catherine said. "I'm asking you to remember that when my children are hurt or scared, they need comfort and support, not criticism and shame. I'm asking you to trust that children can learn strength through security rather than through emotional suppression." Before Camilla could respond, the drawing room door opened and Charlotte appeared, followed by her brothers. The little girl's face was flushed from playing outside, and for the first time that afternoon, she looked like the spirited, confident child Catherine knew her to be. "Mama," Charlotte said excitedly, "Grandpapa's gardener showed us the most beautiful butterfly garden, and Louis caught a frog, but we let it go because George said it needed to be with its family." The innocent joy in Charlotte's voice created a stark contrast to the heavy, emotional atmosphere the adults had been navigating. Catherine felt her heart swell with protective love as she watched her daughter's animated expression. "That sounds wonderful, darling," Catherine said, opening her arms to embrace Charlotte, who ran to her immediately. As Catherine held her daughter, she made eye contact with both Charles and Camilla over Charlotte's head. The message was clear. This child's emotional well-being was worth every difficult conversation, every family conflict, and every diplomatic complication they had endured that afternoon. "Grandmama Camilla," Charlotte said, turning toward her step-grandmother with newfound confidence. "Did you know that butterflies taste with their feet? The gardener told us all about it." Camilla looked at the bright, enthusiastic child before her and seemed to see her clearly for perhaps the first time. Instead of focusing on royal protocols or appropriate behavior, she saw a 10-year-old girl who was excited to share something she had learned. "I didn't know that, Charlotte," Camilla said, her voice gentler than Catherine had heard it all afternoon. "That's quite fascinating. Would you like to tell me more about what you learned in the garden?" Charlotte's face lit up even brighter, and she launched into an animated description of butterflies, frogs, and various garden discoveries. As she spoke, gesturing excitedly with her small hands, Catherine watched Camilla's face transform from the rigid composure of earlier to something approaching wonder at the child's natural enthusiasm. Charles caught Catherine's eye and nodded almost imperceptibly, a signal that he understood the significance of this moment. Here was Charlotte being completely herself, emotional, excited, and authentically childlike, and receiving positive attention rather than criticism or correction. As the afternoon progressed, Catherine observed carefully as Camilla interacted with all three children. The older woman seemed to be making a conscious effort to engage with their natural personalities rather than trying to mold them into predetermined notions of royal behavior. When Louis spilled juice on his shirt and looked worried about getting in trouble, Camilla simply helped him clean up without any lectures about proper table manners. When George asked a question about why some flowers were different colors, she encouraged his curiosity rather than redirecting him toward more suitable topics. Most significantly, when Charlotte mentioned that she was nervous about her next writing lesson, Camilla knelt down to the child's eye level and said, "It's perfectly natural to feel nervous about something that scared you before. Would you like me to come with you to offer moral support?" Catherine felt tears of relief spring to her eyes as she watched this interaction. It wasn't a complete transformation. That would take time and continued effort, but it was evidence that change was possible when adults were willing to prioritize children's emotional needs over rigid adherence to traditional approaches. As the visit wound down and it came time to leave, Catherine reflected on everything that had transpired during what had begun as a simple family afternoon tea. The confrontation had been difficult and emotionally exhausting, but it had also created an opening for conversations that might never have happened otherwise. While helping the children gather their things, Catherine found herself alone with Camilla for a brief moment in the hallway. "Thank you," Catherine said quietly, "for being willing to try a different approach." Camilla nodded. her expression still carrying traces of the emotional turbulence they had all experienced. "I want you to know," Camilla replied, "that I do love those children. I may not always show in ways you recognize or approve of, but I do love them." "I know you do," Catherine said sincerely. "And they love you too. That's why today mattered so much. Love should make children feel safer and more confident, not more anxious about being themselves." As they walked toward the car, where William's protection officers were waiting, Charlotte slipped her small hand into Catherine's and looked up with a smile that seemed to contain all the confidence and joy that had been missing earlier in their visit. "Mama," Charlotte said contentedly, "I think Grandmama Camilla really likes butterflies almost as much as I do." Catherine squeezed her daughter's hand gently, understanding that this simple observation represented something much more significant. Evidence that authentic connection was possible when adults chose to see children as complete individuals deserving of respect and emotional support. The confrontation that had begun with tears and accusations had evolved into something that might, with continued effort and commitment from all parties, become a foundation for healthier family relationships. It wasn't a perfect resolution. There would undoubtedly be challenges and setbacks ahead, but it was a beginning. As their car pulled away from Highgrove House, Catherine looked back at Charles and Camilla standing in the doorway, waving goodbye to their grandchildren. She realized that sometimes the most important battles aren't won through diplomatic compromise, but through the courage to demand better treatment for those we love, even when that demand creates discomfort for everyone involved. The royal family would continue to face the challenges of balancing public duty with private emotional health, but Charlotte, George, and Louis would grow up knowing that their feelings mattered, that their authentic selves were valued, and that the adults who claimed to love them could be trusted to provide support rather than criticism when life inevitably became difficult. In the end, that knowledge might prove to be the strongest foundation of all for whatever challenges royal life would bring to the next generation.